Today I'm joined by Abhishek Roy, staff user interface researcher at Google, who specialises in online deception prevention and child safety. Abhishek has led groundbreaking work on how scams exploit human psychology and most recently created Be Scam Ready, Google's new interactive game designed to help people build real-world resilience against online scams. You'll hear us refer to Shield Up a few times in this episode. That was the pilot name for the game before it officially launched as Be Scam Ready. In our conversation, Abhishek shares why awareness campaigns alone aren't enough, how scammers prey on emotion and overconfidence, and how game-based learning can serve as psychological self-defense. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why scams still thrive despite awareness, how manipulation techniques target high-risk groups like teens, how interactive learning builds lasting resilience, and a simple acronym, HALT, that's HALT, that anyone can use to pause and protect themselves. So, let's jump into it. The internet wasn't built with safety in mind. But today, there's a huge community of online trust and safety experts, not just building the rules, but enforcing them too. I'm Ailish Daly, and this is Trust Issues, insights from the people who keep the internet safe. In each edition, we meet the experts shaping how the world experiences the internet, what's allowed online, what's not, and the future of how platforms will protect people. Let's share knowledge and build a safer internet together. Abhishek Roy, thank you so much for making the time to speak with me today. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of participating in a live test of Shield Up during Google's Anti-Scam Summit in Dublin. And the experience, it really stuck with me. I have been exploring how game-based approaches like Shield Up could help people build real-world scam resilience. Fraud, scams, misinformation in general may be emerging as the biggest threat to teens since cyberbullying. So that's what I'm hoping to dive into today with yourself. Could you tell us the story behind Shield Up? What inspired the idea and what problem were you aiming to solve?
Thanks for having me. First of all, I will say we had been doing a bunch of research around scams even starting from 2018. So this wasn't like a new foray for us, but over time, increasingly in our research and also in external research, we saw this kind of a frustrating paradox emerge, which was we saw that awareness about scams was gradually increasing and it was kind of quite high, yet the victimization rates were also skyrocketing globally. And there are a variety of factors behind this. Obviously, we got more online during COVID, more uptake of fast payment systems, and also the kind of isolation that comes from COVID. So a lot changed during COVID, including how organized crime behaves and where they're focused on. But for us, we saw this kind of an insane skyrocketing hockey stick graph for victimization rates around the world. And also we saw that we were slowly getting more aware as well about scams. But there was this sort of like awareness action gap that we were able to pinpoint, both in our research and also research done externally by GASA, which is the Global Anti-Scam Alliance. Also some of the banks, when they were putting out research, they have called this out. And also governments like the government of Singapore, where awareness rates are pretty high, they have also called it out in some of their outputs. We saw this kind of trend, and we also noticed that the traditional warnings that we have essentially set up, where usually we run advertisement campaigns, they're often kind of ephemeral. So we usually have these waves of campaigns and then they kind of go away. They're kind of failing often because they ignored the fundamental psychology of deception or how these scam attacks happen. Primarily, we were relying on the fact that if we purely give people more information, they will be able to protect themselves. And theoretically, that might be true, but in practice, we know that simply giving people more information is often insufficient because we are unable to recall those protective measures that we read about when we are actually under the scam attack or when we are actually under threat. Because because our kind of rational thinking parts of the brain, slow thinking parts of the brain get hijacked and they bypass it. So our goal behind creating Shield Up, which will externally, like when we launch this, Project Shield Up is graduating to Be Scam Ready. So Be Scam Ready is the program. And our thought process behind this was, how do we move us beyond just giving people information? How do we actually help them build active psychological resilience? So, in 5 words, we are essentially trying to move people from passive awareness to active resilience.
That's an absolutely fascinating. And how did your work at Google inform the way you approach designing a game to tackle scams?
So first of all, at Google, at Trust and Safety, the first thing that you notice is the scale of the problem. Because when you start researching, especially qualitatively, talking to former victim survivors, and then also talking to experts in academia and law enforcement, which we heavily consult with, you see the real human cost behind this, which feels personal. But when you're also working in trust and safety at Google, you see that this is felt at scale. So even though these stories are very intense and personal, they're also happening at scale. So that's the first thing that you notice. The second piece that kind of corollary from that is essentially that we rely very heavily on technical defenses. And technical defenses are absolutely crucial. Google obviously invests a lot in fighting scams with AI and other cutting edge technology. And we have been at the forefront of fighting scams as a problem. But there is also kind of a need for an investment in the human layer of vulnerability here, because all of us have some amount of psychological vulnerabilities that scammers are able to target. And so we saw that we needed to invest more in the user resilience side of the equation here. And so, like, the way we think about this is consumers and us as users are often the last line of defense in scam attacks, and often the weakest link as well, because once a scammer hijacks our psychological vulnerabilities, it's very hard for us to play defense. And so this kind of informed our approach. First was, any solution we come up with has to be scalable. So we can't just design something that works for, say, Brazil, or works for the UK, or only works for Australia. It has to kind of scale with the growth of the problem. And the second piece, which I personally care a lot about, and also at Google we care a lot about, which is database decision making. So any kind of solution we come up with has to be rigorously evidence based. So not only do we want to build something and say, hey, this works, we also want to go and do the work and actually test whether this works or not. So those are the two primary ways this has informed our approach here.
Okay, that's fascinating. And from your perspective, what makes scams and to a certain extent misinformation in general so effective at targeting teens specifically?
This feels like slightly of an emerging area of research, but so there's a lot of research in the scam space around gerontology and how scams affect older adults. And there is a little bit of a correlation here with older adults. There is, on average, a trend of, say, cognitive decline. And there's a lot of research associated with cognitive decline and social isolation and how scams affect them. One kind of often kind of takes that and naturally extrapolates to younger audiences, where the idea is that there are going to be some trait vulnerabilities associated with just being young and being online. So if you can think about this, like, so the first source of vulnerability from the research we have done and from kind of my understanding of the space is purely just the whole surface area, right? So teens spend a large part of their lives online, and the total surface area of exposure to these kind of attacks for them is just inherently larger because they are digitally native. And so with higher exposures, like, comes slightly higher rates of victimization. The second piece, obviously, which I was talking about, like psychological vulnerabilities point of view, I think this is slightly under researched, but there are some trends which are emerging based on, say, qualitative research that we have done in this space, especially studying stories told by younger audiences online, either on self reported stories they have told on, say, social media or on, say, news media. We have essentially tried to study them in terms like thematically, and we have identified there's some kind of trends emerging. Number one is they often get heavily influenced by social validation and fear of missing out, which is often kind of exploited by scammers. And the second piece is often there is slightly higher social group based peer pressure compared to some of the other age groups. And the third piece is, and this is a through line that we have seen across cultures, is like this general inherent sense of optimism about the world and better outcomes. We all have this when we are younger, and I relate to how I used to feel when I was younger, and that kind of also plays a role. Um, and then finally, I will say, I think there's also this sense of confidence and self belief in their own digital literacy skills. So this is kind of like a double-edged sword because self-efficacy and confidence is extremely important. Younger consumers can tend to sometimes lean into overconfidence with their digital literacy skills because they are so online and they feel, hey, I'm slightly more well-versed in how the online sphere works. And we have seen some evidence for this in some of the new research coming out of. Generally, overconfidence essentially makes you scrutinize what is happening in front of you slightly less. You are more likely to form habits when you are more online, and essentially, these habits often don't help us when we are making mistakes. And so, ironically, any of this kind of leaning into overconfidence into our own skills can end up kind of making us less likely to stop and double check. And those are some of the vulnerabilities that I feel is emerging in this space.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to the younger Ailey Shaley being more fearless, optimistic, and certainly overconfident for sure. I think what I'd love people to understand a little bit more as well is how cognitive development, such as risk assessment and decision making skills, play into this vulnerability. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So I will say I think some of the research around this space is very new, and also I think a lot more research is needed specifically in adolescents related scam attacks. But in general, again, extrapolating from some of the research that has come out, often focused on older adults, we kind of know that the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and risk assessment is still developing in teens, and one can extrapolate and say that this does have some effect on their decision making process, especially when they are under a lot of time or emotional pressure. Speaking of emotional pressure, this is the other piece, which is we are probably more susceptible to emotional hot states, which is like intense amount of excitement or fear or urgency. And these are kind of the common tools in the trade that scammers use to kind of hijack our critical thinking part of the brain. So it doesn't allow us to slow down and think rationally. But kind of we have to really make like a knee-jerk reaction. We are more likely to make mistakes. And finally, I'll say this is less of a cognitive development piece, but often sometimes is said to be related to risk assessment, is often younger audiences don't adequately safeguard their own sensitive information online. And this is kind of like a trend we have seen in younger and older audiences who are less digitally native, more digitally native. But in general, not safeguarding your sensitive information online makes it more likely to stage a more convincing attack for the scammers. And this could be in all kinds of spheres, not only, say, jobs related stuff or anything. It can also be, say, romance related or social relationship related attacks that scammers often mount.
Okay, it's fascinating. And yeah, that idea of the scammer playbook feeding in so seamlessly into bypassing cognitive speed bumps that allow you to pause and take a moment and assess what's in front of you. Could you walk us through how Shield Up works for someone who hasn't seen it?
We did a lot of research around what has worked in the scam space in the past. and what has been tried in the scam space in the past. And the traditional methods have been largely around sharing more tips, either via awareness campaigns or often sometimes via in application messages. But these were largely passive forms of interventions. And for us, what we were trying to do was create more active forms of interventions. An analogy that I often like to use is the difference between reading a safety manual and participating in a fire drill. And it's kind of like the same thing, which is like you know where the fire exits are, but when you participate in a fire drill, it's kind of more of an embodied experience, and you're more likely to build these kind of muscle memories or instincts on what to do when you are under a lot of time and emotional pressure. So that's kind of the initial philosophy behind how Sheila was developed. So we wanted to bring people into these safe environments, almost like sandbox like experiences where you can play and interact with how a scam might work. And what the game tries to do is like a flight simulator, but for scams. So we are trying to simulate realistic scenarios, and that might be like a fake job offer or some kind of a suspicious message. You interact with it and you make choices, and each of your choice has an outcome that decides what happens in the story. And so, kind of crucially, although what we are trying to do in as part of the game is we are trying to break down scams into manipulation techniques. So manipulation techniques form the building blocks of scams. Think of them as the lowest coherent bit of a scam is a manipulation technique. That could be false urgency, it could be impersonation. And after each scenario, after each decision that you have made within a story, we essentially break down how the scam operated in terms of manipulation techniques. So instead of relying on pointing out red flags, like hey, this spelling mistake over here, or hey, this looks more photoshop, you are now more resilient because you are able to recognize the patterns in the stories that the scammers are telling rather than the specific words the scammers are using in the story. And that was crucial with obviously AI and all the new forms of attacks that are being developed by scammers, which are more believable. We needed to kind of we are kind of designing with the eye to the future where, okay, we want to have more resilient users focusing on core building blocks of scams.
And how did you ensure the game was engaging for users, particularly for teenagers whose bars are pretty high when it comes to any sort of gaming in the first place?
Yeah, I think we're designing for all audiences. So even though I know games can often get associated with younger adults, we do feel there is a lot of value to be gained out of simple storytelling, narrative-driven, choice-based games for older audiences as well. And so we wanted to make sure that we focused very heavily on relevance and realism. So we did a lot of work with local law enforcement, local academia, local civil society organizations to try and come up with stories that looked real and felt relevant to our target audiences. So that a lot of work went into that, where we read a lot of stories from victim survivors. We did a lot of research with on-ground stakeholders, try to make this as real and relevant for them as possible. And secondly, we want this to feel interactive. When you're in the sandbox, it shouldn't be something that is happening to you. You have some choice within the narrative and the story that we are telling. We have tried to tell these stories from the point of view of different frequently targeted parts of demographics. Other piece of the puzzle, which is underappreciated in my point of view, is often the lack of empathy we might feel for scam targets. Sometimes we feel if you fall for scams, you are not very smart, or maybe you are not very educated, or you don't have the kind of skills required to navigate digital space. But that's often not true. Irrespective of what your background might be, how well versed you might be, you can always fall for these kind of attacks. And so we wanted to make sure we are telling these stories with a great deal of responsibility and empathy. And we hope our audiences also feel this empathy when they read these stories. And finally, I'll say that we try to build some kind of like a skill ladder within the game, where essentially after each story, you unlock certain new skills. And then you get to use those skills and slow down the timer when you are forced to make a decision. So in the game, for context, we're kind of putting a timer next to all of your decisions, which simulates the same kind of emotional and time pressure. But when you are able to spot the right manipulation technique, the timer extends. And that builds in some of the reward mechanisms that help you understand that, oh, okay, I need to slow down and recognize what is happening instead of make knee-jerk reactions.
When you're doing those design challenges, was there anything that surprised you? Something that you had to change once you tested it with users?
Yes. So this actually came up in a pilot study that we did in India last year with a prototype version of the game, which is what you played when you were testing Shield Up, which is what it was originally called, Project Shield Up. And in the prototype version of the game, we ran this randomized control trial in India with over 3,000 users, randomly allocating them to either playing the game or watching some advertisement campaigns around scams or playing an unrelated game. And there was this sense of spike in skepticism that emerges when you have experienced a lot of scam related examples. This was true for both the awareness campaign related stuff. So when you're exposed to say 10 minutes of awareness campaigns around scams, you come out slightly more skeptical about even genuine offers. And also similarly for the game as well. For the fundamental challenge was, how do we do this balancing act? How do we teach people how to spot deception online, be vigilant without being overly skeptical in the long run?
Totally
Even though
there myself, I didn't pay the customs fee for the genuine custom fee. So I, my overvigilance was costly, and that in itself is problematic. So
absolutely. And I'll say basically that that was the fundamental challenge for us, which is how do we build healthy skepticism and vigilance without creating undue amount of cynicism, especially in the long run. Now, in the prototype, when we tested this, we saw after 21 days, the cynicism kind of goes away. But still, when we were designing the new version of the game, which you will see when this releases later in October this year, is we have thrown in examples of genuine opportunities within the game as well. So it's no longer your own, no longer just kind of interacting with scam situations. You're also trying to figure out whether this is genuine, whether this is a scam. And that hopefully in our testing has helped and will help when we kind of launch this, build kind of healthy skepticism and vigilance without undue cynicism.
what have been the early results and the feedback you've seen since launching the pilot and your iteration since?
Yeah, I think so. The results we have thus far are from the pilot. We are gonna do additional testing. We are doing rigorous randomized control trials in over 7 countries as we speak, and those results will come out later this year or maybe early next year. But from our pilot testing, which we did in India last year, as I was saying, this randomized control trial with 3,000 users, we saw that users who played the Bscam Ready game um, are significantly better at identifying scams as compared to their colleagues who were cohort participants who were in the awareness campaign arm, where they were watching a lot of awareness ad videos, and the arm where they were playing an unrelated game which was not related to scams. And not only that, what was really promising from our end was this is not just a short-lived resilience or efficacy result. When we reached out back to them, a subset of them 21 days later, and asked them to kind of take our standardized test again, which kind of is a test of your ability to recognize scam online. Um, we saw that the resilience was persisting even after 21 days, and this was still higher than the awareness campaign arm. And that was extremely promising for us because obviously we are coming up with more active ways of engagement, but really this could potentially be a promising approach to get a step up from the status quo, which is we are spending most of our resources, most of our attention on awareness campaigns. Could we bring some of the insights from behavioral science and psychology and some of the research that we have done into the scam awareness space and make this slightly more effective? And that's kind of where we are kind of leaning in.
Amazing. So in that testing then of those results, is that measuring impact on scam recognition rates or digital literacy skills or a bit of both?
So this is essentially scam recognition rates. I will say that digital literacy skills and scam recognition are highly correlated, but it is kind of, and you would expect they would be correlated. Obviously, you have better digital literacy skills, you have better hygiene in terms of how you operate online, how you keep your information private and safe online. And not clicking on links when you don't know the sender, or kind of hovering over the links and checking where the URL is going to lead you and all of that stuff. All of those things obviously do play a part in your resilience online. But what we were focused on is your general ability to recognize scam and genuine opportunities and being able to separate between those two as they might happen to you in real life. And so the way we do this is using this standardized test that we developed, which we will come out with some kind of an external manifestation of, where it's called the scam recognition ability test, SRAT. And it has a bunch of realistic and robust mocks of how scams appear in real life. In all different types of formats. There are 36 different types of scams. So we kind of really mocked the entire universe. And then we worked with a lot of local experts from law enforcement to academia to civil society organizations to then say, hey, does this really look real if this was to be in Brazil? And they will say, no, this is not how it would work. And then we will then go and refine this. So there was this whole process behind how we came up with these, confident that this is realistic, and these examples are also common. So these are not just some esoteric types of scams. These are commonly also happening in your ecological environment, in your digital environment. We then test you. So 10 questions, 5 scam, 5 not scam, and then you answer. And based on how you score, we essentially assess whether or not you're improving. And so that's how we did that.
We always see about the evolution of scam tactics, and what scammers are doing is constantly breaking boundaries and going into new frontiers. How do you keep a training game relevant in that context?
I think this, you kind of hit the nail on its head. I think this was one of the central challenges we were also trying to solve, because I alluded to this earlier, which was about the scale issue. So scale not only comes in in this space of audience sizes, but also in the rapid growth in the type of tools the scammers are utilizing. For example, they are now using a lot of AI-based tools to ca- develop more fluent, more persuasive messages. They no longer have spelling mistakes in those messages. And they also have more convincing impersonation attacks, because they're able to use a lot of kind of new, readily available, democratized tools to be able to do that. And in general, the setup time to for a scammer to set up their operation has kind of gone down from months to weeks to sometimes even days. So for us, what you will see is one of the core advantages from our approach is we are focused on what we call technique-based inoculation in academia. And the idea here is, instead of training you on specific scenarios, instead of just learning how to recognize patterns in job scams or in, say, investment scams, or I don't know, let's say some other type of scam around, like, say, romance scams. Instead of recognizing specific scenarios, you are really trying to recognize these underlying manipulation techniques, as I was alluding to earlier. And when you recognize these building blocks of scams, it also gives you a sort of cross protection. And this is something that we actually tested in our pilot study in India, where we actually train you only on 3 types of scams in the game. But in the test, you actually experience 5 types of scams. And on average, you're able to identify even the scams you had never seen before in the intervention. And we are able to see some evidence of cross protection coming from this technique. Um, in general, I'll summarize by saying that um, the stories, as I was saying, the scammers tell and the techniques they use might change over time, but these psychological tricks, these manipulation techniques, are timeless. And they form the core building blocks, so you can't escape them. They have arrived at this via a lot of practice, and obviously distillation, and so they can't escape these techniques. And so by learning these techniques, you kind of sort of build these muscle memories, regardless of the story the scammer is telling.
I mean, to go back to our earlier point about optimism sometimes is reserved for the youth, I feel really optimistic about that this is a genuine way of tackling this. So if you have that foundational ability to build that muscle, you will be resilient to scams that you've never come across before, you've never heard before, because there's a certain pattern that's been followed and that you recognize that. So that is really optimistic. How do you see tools like Be Scam Safe or Shield Up fitting into wider online safety and trust and safety strategies for platforms?
I think it's kind of like a crucial layer of defense. I think humans are a crucial layer of defense. As this is something we deeply believe in investing in at Google, making our users more resilient. So we often think about robust safety strategies in terms of, like, say, platforms or societies as requiring technical safeguards, requiring strong enforcement. And both of those are absolutely true. We need stronger technical safeguards, we need stronger enforcement. Effective enforcement rates in scam are not high enough because of the cross platform, cross border nature of it. But yes, we need to do that, but we also need to invest in making our users and consumers more resilient. And I think governments, law enforcement, civil society, and even platforms for that matter, in industry from banking to telco, everyone kind of recognizes this fact. What we are trying to do with Shield Up is address this kind of third critical pillar, which is user resilience, which is how do we tackle this social engineering part of the problem, which, when effectively exploited by scammers, effectively bypasses the other two pillars of technical safeguards and strong enforcement. So we can do everything we can in this space around safeguards and enforcement, but if we don't make our users resilient, I suspect it won't work. And also, because as I was saying, humans are kind of like the weakest link in the kill chain, is often what security researchers say. Um, to borrow that phrase from them, um, investing in any additional delta gain in user resilience can have compounding effects on the overall safety of the community and the platform and the user platform interaction space. And that's kind of a core belief that I have, that my colleagues have, and that's why we have invested in this space.
And so, do you think that this approach can it work in partnership with social platforms, with educational institutions like educational curriculums, or even wellness apps that might pride themselves on kind of removing misinformation or removing mistruth from their services?
Absolutely. I think this is another piece of our strategy, and really not even strategy, is like our design philosophy behind Be Scam Ready was the methodology behind it, which is, say, inoculation theory from psychology, is designed to be platform agnostic. So when you kind of come into Be Scam Ready and you play the game and you learn these new skills, it's not like you are only going to use them on, say, Google platforms. You're going to use them, you're going to take them and use them in all other forms of your digital sphere. You're going to use them on when you're using your banking apps. You're going to use them when you're forming social relationships on social media. We strongly believe in this ethos and this kind of core design principle that our interventions have to be platform agnostic. They have to make users resilient not just on our platforms but the entire internet. So that's a core part of a design philosophy. The second piece is we strongly advocate for in our partnership strategy, in what we are trying to develop, like a alliance with a lot of partners here in this space, is interactive training. This could be in, say, school curricula. This could be in community centers for folks looking for jobs, for older adults. It can also be embedded directly into platforms or financial apps to kind of meet users where they are. And I would strongly advocate people to either explore their own versions of this or kind of just partner with us, and we can explore how we can work on this together.
Fascinating. And I suppose, from the context of and with Purify, who are part of InTouch CX, a major customer experience platform, if you could collaborate with customer experience teams at major platforms, what role do you see them playing in making scam awareness baked in rather than bolted on?
So I have actually coincidentally written about this in one of my opinion pieces for Tech for Good Institute. But to kind of summarize this very briefly, we can use some of the insights from our work around inoculation theory, and also how that applies to scam space to transform what we call risky moments into teachable opportunities. A lot of customer experience related work is focused on, hey, are you sure this is the right thing to do? Or, hey, pay attention when you are making this transaction. Hey, look, this person is credible because we have verified them. And a lot of these interventions have traditionally focused on credibility cues, which is this person is verified, or on attention cues, essentially saying, are you sure? Pay attention, those kind of things. And so they form a really good layer of intervention around what we call just-in-time interventions. So you kind of meet the moment where it is happening, and then you intervene just in time. And so I think from a customer experience standpoint, we could potentially transform these risky moments into teachable opportunities by briefly explaining when they are interacting in these risky moments. Hey, this might be a false urgency tactic being used on you. When you're on a phone and you have a banking app open, it's potentially highly likely that something wrong might be happening, and that's where you can kind of show some kind of a teachable moment in terms of inoculation, rather than simply telling them that this might be scam. Because oftentimes people are truly convinced they're talking to a police officer, or they're talking to someone they have had a relationship over online for the last couple of months, and they may be dismissive of some of the interventions if we don't implore them using some of these insights from inoculation theory.
Okay, amazing. That's really, really helpful and insightful. Um, when you think about technology companies providing a better balance of user experience when it comes to safety, or how that applies to teens, can technology companies better balance user experience with safety when it comes to a young person?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a this is a debate I've had with folks in the space. I think from a Google standpoint, we have heavily invested in what we call safety by design. And the core philosophy behind this is that we don't see safe online experiences and good user experiences as opposing forces. We see them as the same thing. And for teens, for older adults, for anyone in between, safe experience is good user experience. Feeling unsafe somehow just to kind of make people feel slightly more frictionless in their user experience is not the end goal. We often talk about kind of integrating meaningful friction when necessary. So, meaningless friction is what frustrates users and creates bad user experiences. But meaningful interventions or meaningful friction, when induced very thoughtfully and carefully with a lot of rigor, in user experiences, can create safer online user journeys overall. And so we can often call this like we have called this often friction with purpose. I think this has been said in other spaces as well. But the idea here is introducing thoughtful speed bumps at high risk moments that kind of prompt some amount of self reflection rather than optimizing purely for speed. And so I think they are one and the same thing, and less of a balancing act.
Well, we've spent some time as well with survivors of scams and fraud who have reflected on that and said, I would have loved the friction. That would have been the best outcome for me in terms of my user experience. Um, what's your vision for the role games and interactive learning could play in online safety 5 years from now?
I think so. So one thing that like I'm acutely aware of is oftentimes serious games or educational games or any such interactive game-based tools have some kind of a half-life. So obviously they are built for purpose. They are built for an educational purpose. So they are not supposed to be addictive. They're not supposed to be infinitely usable forever. So they do inherently have some kind of a half life where it might be ranging from, I don't know, like 6 months to 2 years or whatever. So one of the things that we focus very heavily on is how do we make this a durable and robust intervention for the online space. So that does not that whole creation of experience cannot just stop at designing the game. We need to develop a scaffolding structure around it And so Be Scam Ready is essentially truly a graduation from Project Shield Up, where we are now developing a scaffolding around it, where you have educational material, some of which we are putting up, some of which we are want to develop with folks who are specialized in developing curriculum material around this. So we are very heavily focused on developing curriculum material around Shield Up and not just giving the game as a solo experience. So overall, the vision is for us to be able to use these interactive learning tools and have them become ubiquitous and seamlessly integrated into our digital lives, and not just be like standalone educational tools. So you are building, it's like a psychological self-defense training of sorts.
What has been the most surprising thing that you've learned about scams or indeed scam victims during your, incredibly comprehensive work on this?
I think so I was talking about this earlier, but really the biggest piece has been reading about stories of former victim survivors, and also talking to some victim survivors. We see this kind of the deep impact it has on them, not obviously just financial impact, but also like the psychological scarring that happens when you undergo something so traumatic. It can undo years of work they might have done on themselves, or essentially set them back on essentially ever being able to trust people or opportunities online. That has been extremely moving, and also been a very motivating factor for all of us when we were developing this. And so the most humbling realization for us was that vulnerability, it has very little to do with intelligence. As I was saying earlier, it's about like emotional context. So we often talk about state-based vulnerability versus trait-based vulnerability. You might be very resilient in all other spheres of your life, or let's say you have traditionally been thought of by your colleagues and friends and family as being a very emotionally resilient person. But let's say you are extremely distracted at work, and you have 500 things that are piling up that you need to get done with. And that's a state of emotional context that can often make you more vulnerable. So, our vulnerabilities have very little to do with intelligence. It has way more to do with our state based context in the moment. And as I was saying earlier, overconfidence in our own abilities, which is I'm too smart to be scammed, is one of the biggest factors. GASA has been talking about this forever. We have seen this in our research and externally as well by academia. But one of the things we are trying to do with Be Scam Ready is actually bring people into these experiences so they realize that vulnerability has very little to do with smartness or intelligence or education level for that matter, and a lot more to do with the context you are operating under.
And Abhishek, mind I say that it's so evident that you have such an enormous amount of empathy, and that being fed into this really important work is, testament to how impactful it's going to be. The most impactful pieces of work are one that are fueled by a desire to help others, and it's quite clear you have that in spades. Um, this is my final question to you. If you were to give one piece of advice to every parent or every teen who is concerned about being scammed, concerned about, their own vulnerabilities, is there any piece of advice that you might give them?
Yeah. So there's the other space of research that we have been doing, which is how can we boil down the vast space of safety tips into something that people can remember. And there's a lot of research that has gone into this. I like, if you don't take away anything else from this conversation, um, you take away the acronym HALT, HALT, and HALT is an acronym for H is for hurried. Are you feeling hurried? Are you feeling under a lot of time pressure? Are you feeling that you're under a lot of time pressure? You may want to take a breath, step back, and verify who you're talking to. A is authentic, which is the person you're talking to is really who they say they are. L is likelihood, which is this scheme reasonable? Does this make sense in the sense that someone is giving me a work from home job, which is so easy and doesn't have any requirements? And T is, can I just talk to someone? I think this is an highly underappreciated piece of advice and often underutilized. But the way our human brains operate, when we elaborate and we talk out what we are doing in terms of the decision making process, we are way less likely to make mistakes. And so this would be like my core piece of advice to anyone who is listening is talk to someone, talk to your friends, talk to your family, reach out for advice. This can make the difference between you falling for that scary call from a police officer, obviously a scammer impersonating a police officer, and you kind of falling for the scam. And so those are my final piece of advice for anyone listening, anyone who cares to take my advice.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely fascinating and insightful, and it really has bolstered what my original perception was, even in that pilot stage, of the potential of a gaming opportunity like Be Scam Ready is a great way to go. And I believe that this is a really important step.
Thanks for tuning in to Trust Issues, brought to you by Web Purify, an InTouch CX company. What are your thoughts on today's conversation? And what do you want to hear about next? Get in touch with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to keep the discussion going. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories, insights, and behind the scenes voices from the world of trust and safety.